True, A Native European Spirituality by Stephen A. McNallen. Chapter 22, The Days of Remembrance. The Days of Remembrance are modern inventions. I composed them when I was relatively new to our faith, a mere 15 years or so into my spiritual journey. The Viking influence, in contrast to my later pan-Germanic approach, is strongly apparent in them. They are not traditional in the sense of being 1,200 years old, but they are traditional insofar as they date back to the earliest days of the Germanic religious revival in the United States, and that in itself is a worthy thing. It is good to remember those who fought and died to keep our religion alive during the long centuries of Christian persecution. The constant effort to imitate the bravery and sacrifice of these men and women builds our character and makes us better people. Also truer, if they are true to their faith, constantly seek self-improvement. This is especially so when it comes to the heroic virtues conjured as we read the Days of Remembrance. Courage, honor, loyalty to one's faith and one's ancestors, prowess in battle, sharpness of wit, dedication to kin. Each of the heroes and martyrs and accomplished men and women in this list can show us the way to be more and to do more. How do we celebrate these days of remembrance? Simply reading about them reminds us of the men and women being honored, but this in itself is hardly enough. We should spend at least a few moments in reflection to consider how these heroic individuals relate to our own lives, and how we can use these special days to make ourselves a little more like them. January 9th, Day of Remembrance for Raud the Strong. When King Olaf Tryggvason was making Norway Christian by fire and sword, there lived a man named Raud the Strong. He was a follower of our gods and had little time for the newly mandated faith. Raud was not only strong, he was rich and influential, which made him an especially tempting target for royal wrath. Tryggvason had him captured and demanded his conversion. Raud refused, so Olaf forced him to swallow a snake, resulting in his death. This got rid of the influential Asatruer and cleared the way for the king to confiscate Raud's land for himself. February 9th, Day of Remembrance for Ivan Kinrefi. Ivan was led into a trap and captured by Olaf Tryggvason's men, who tossed him at the king's feet. At first, Tryggvason and his bishop tried to persuade Ivan of the new faith's rightness. When that didn't work, they bribed him with gifts and a share in the royal revenues. Ivan refused, so they set a bowl of red-hot coals on his abdomen and cooked his organs while he was still alive. According to the saga, Ivan's stomach burst under this torture, and he died. March 9th, Day of Remembrance for Olvir. Olvir, like most men and women in the district around Trondheim Fjord, remained true to the Aesir and Vanir, long after King Tryggvason declared Christianity the one true faith of the land. To get around the royal decree, a group of men secretly organized the traditional festivals. Olvir was a leader of this resistance. When Tryggvason found out about this, he brought his army and killed Olvir as well as many of his companions. Those who were less involved were driven out of the country or fined. March 28th, Ragnar Lothbrok Day. On this day, in the year 845 CE, a Viking named Ragnar attacked Paris and caused major destruction, not the least of which was the burning of 3 churches. It is probably not a coincidence that this happened on Easter Sunday. The perpetrator, who is reputed to have been none other than Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the greatest Norsemen and hero of the saga which bears his name. If raiding Paris on Easter Sunday and burning churches sounds like a religiously motivated attack, well, it may have been. Historians used to think that the Viking Age arose solely from the desire for loot and land. More recently, historians have made the case that many Norsemen were defending our native religion and culture in the face of the deliberate, aggressive, and intolerant expansion of Christian missionary activity into the Northlands. No doubt 3 medieval churches in Paris would be worthy targets because that's where the gold and other fine things were kept. But why on Easter Sunday? Ragnar was striking a blow for his gods and his people. April 9th, Day of Remembrance for Jarl Håkon. Håkon Sigurdsson joined forces with the King of Denmark to conquer Norway and defeat its king, Harald Finehair, a Christian. In return, Håkon was made Jarl, or Earl, over the western part of the country. Jarl Håkon was a devout follower of the gods and a defender of the traditional freedoms that went with Asatru. He brought back ancient rights of chieftains and farmers, rebuilt the temples that had been destroyed, and allowed the folk to once more follow their ancestral way. Peace ruled the country, and the people prospered. Even the crops in the fields seemed to respond to the restoration of freedom and holiness. This period lasted many years. Then a dispute broke out with some of the residents in the Trøndelag area. Håkon lost support as the inhabitants sided with the newcomer, Olaf Tryggvason, who was later to become king and renew the persecution of Asatru. Jarl Håkon was eventually murdered. May 9th, Day of Remembrance for Gudrud. King Olaf the Stout of Norway, later known as Saint Olaf, continued the tradition of persecuting anyone who held true to the gods. Along with this religious oppression came the consolidation of political power in royal hands and the revocation of the rights of the freemen. This caused much muttering among the people. A meeting of the regional upland kings was called to debate these issues. Indecision prevailed until Gudrid, king of Gudbrandsdale, rose to speak. According to the saga, his words were these: "We are 5 kings, each as well-born as Olaf, yet you are thoroughly afraid of him. Not long ago, we helped him in his fight against Earl Svein, and it is with our support that he took back power in this country. If he now begrudges each of us the little power we have left, and tyrannizes and oppresses us, then I for one say I will never be a slave to him. You are not men if you are afraid to cut off his ventures into our lands. We shall never be free men while Olaf is alive." These bold words carried the day, and the Uplands rose in opposition. A traitor carried word of the plot to Olaf, who moved against them and captured them all. The king had Gudrid's tongue cut out. June 8th, Lindisfarne Day. The Viking Age officially began on June 8th in the year 793, when 3 ships loaded with Norwegian raiders descended on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. Since the Holy Isle, as the Christians called it, was a center for missionary activity, and because the attack had come with no warning, Christian kingdoms everywhere stirred with panic. Lindisfarne Day was one of the first days of remembrance we established early in the Asatru revival. It, along with Ragnar Lodbrok Day, shows how attached we were to the romantic figure of the Vikings during the 1970s. Both of these holy days celebrate Norse military victories over Christianity. Our Christian friends may not understand this, since they've been taught that the conversion of the North was accomplished peacefully. The truth, however, is that the Viking world was under cultural, political, and religious attack by the Church. The Norsemen struck back against the centers of the Church's power, and Lindisfarne was thus a prime target. June 9th, Day of Remembrance for Sigurd the Volsung. No Teutonic hero overshadows Sigurd. Of all the great warriors and striding conquerors, of all the brilliant poets and stubborn martyrs, none can match his fame. His saga was passed on to us by both the continental and the Scandinavian branches of the Germanic peoples. Richard Wagner adapted this epic tale of love, valor, and betrayal for his great ring cycle. Sigurd, the slayer of dragons and winner of the cursed treasure, will be known and praised for as long as our folk lives to hear his deeds. July 9th, Day of Remembrance for Un, the deep-minded. Un was a powerful woman from the Laxdela saga who immigrated to Scotland to avoid the hostility of the Christian monarch Harold Finehair. She established dynasties in the Orkney and Faroe Islands by carefully choosing mates for her granddaughters. When Un settled in Iceland, she continued to show all those traits which were her hallmarks: a strong will, determination to control events, dignity, and a noble character. In the last days of her life, she solidified her line by selecting one of her grandsons as heir. Un died during the grandson's wedding celebration, having accomplished her goals and worked out her fate here in Midgard. She received a typical Norse ship burial, surrounded by her treasure, and by the shining glory of her reputation. August 9th, Day of Remembrance for King Radbod of Frisia. Christian missionaries in Frisia had done well, and King Radbod had agreed to accept the new faith. As the day of his baptism drew near, the king voiced one nagging doubt. What about all his ancestors who had died without recourse to Christ? Where were they spending eternity? The monkish reply was swift and certain. All the heathens were writhing in hellish agony. The king, showing that the noble blood still flowed through his veins, proudly responded, "Then I would rather be suffering there with them than go to heaven with a parcel of beggars." The baptism was cancelled, the priests were sent scurrying, and Frisia remained free of the Christian yoke for many years to come. September 9th, Day of Remembrance for Herman of Cherusci. Few heroes have served our folk as greatly as Herman, leader of the German tribe called the Cherusci. When the Romans crossed the Rhine to push deeper into German territory, Herman organized a confederation of tribes to oppose them. The invasion ended abruptly when Herman's forces annihilated 3 of Varus's legions in the Teutoburger forest in the autumn of 9 CE. Thanks to Herman's rallying of the Cherusci and affiliated tribes, Roman ambitions were largely frustrated. Without his efforts, Roman settlements would have sprung up in the Germanic heartland, ultimately changing the very character of the people. Herman gave us the time and territory we needed, and made possible the Germany we have come to know. October 8th, Day of Remembrance for Eric the Red. Eric the Red is commonly remembered as the father of his more famous son, Leif Erikson. Each October, as the country gets ready to celebrate Columbus Day, jaded newspaper reporters and the Sons of Norway remind us that, after all, the sailor from Genoa was about 500 years too late. Leif gets the spotlight, but standing not far back in the shadows is that old rogue Eric. Back in the early 1980s or so, I decided that Eric deserved more prominence. When I learned that October 9th had been formally declared Leif Erikson Day, I decided to give Leif's stalwart sire a day of his own. Since October 9th was already Leif's Day, we opted to celebrate it a day before, hence the departure from our usual pattern of celebrating days of remembrance on the 9th of every month. Eric was a dedicated follower of Thor. He stayed loyal to his blustery god, even when his wife converted to Christianity and wouldn't sleep with him anymore. I don't imagine Eric went without a bedmate, and his wife got a little chapel built right over the hill where her heathen husband wouldn't have to see it when he looked out of the house. November 9th, Day of Remembrance for Queen Sigrid of Sweden. Sigrid, widow of King Eric the Victorious, was an attractive woman whose hand was sought by one royal suitor after another. She rebuffed them, some of them violently, and it wasn't without reason that history gives her the nickname Sigrid the Haughty. However, one proposal finally won her over, that of Olaf Tryggvason, King of Norway. Olaf, you may remember, was a zealous Christian who slaughtered Asatruer from one end of his domain to the other. There was one catch. Olaf insisted that Sigrid must give up the gods and become a Christian. She refused, saying, "I do not mean to abandon the faith I have had and my kinsmen before me. nor shall I object your belief in the God you prefer." The king swore at her and slapped at her across the face with a glove he held in his hand. Sigrid rose, stared at him coldly, and warned him that his deed might well be his doom. Clearly, the wedding was off. Years went by. Sigrid married King Svein of Denmark and produced a son, Olaf, who became King of Sweden. He, along with King Svein and Earl Eric of Norway, went to war against Tryggvason, largely at Sigrid's instigation. Tryggvason was defeated and killed himself by leaping off his ship and drowning. Sigrid had indeed gotten her revenge. Asatruer today remembers Sigrid for standing by the gods rather than marrying Olaf, despite the king's fame and reputation. Her steadfastness deprived Olaf of her considerable political power and possibly slowed the Christianization of Scandinavia. December 9th, Day of Remembrance for Egil Skallagrimson. Viking Egil Skallagrimson was a rare synthesis of action and introspection, of daring and thoughtful complexity. How do we explain such a man? Extremely violent when angered, broad-shouldered, taller than most, with craggy and harsh features. Egil was a ferocious fighter who met every inch of the Viking image. Odin was his god, and the blood of berserkers and shapeshifters ran in his veins. His lust for gold and fame drove him from land to land, from one adventure to the next, in a powerful saga that some consider the best in Icelandic literature. But Egil was also passionately devoted to his friends. He was generous to those who found his favor. Egil's hard warrior heart was torn when tragedy took his sons, and in his grief he gave us the unforgettable poem Sonatoric, the irreparable loss of sons. The same brain that directed axe blows and planned raids also seethed with poetry and expressed it with a skill that calmed the anger of hostile kings. Odin's inspiration showed itself in skaldic metaphor and meter as truly as in berserk fury and splintered shields. Egil Skallagrimson lived a life of the sword and of poetry. To say that he was a remarkable man, deserving of our remembrance, is an understatement. With the mighty Egil, we bring this chapter to a conclusion. It has been a long journey, from the purpose of religious festivals, to the wheel of the year, and finally to the days of remembrance. These are some of the ways in which modern Asatruer observe their faith. It is important to remember that no single set of holy days will recreate the ritual life of our ancestors. This was always a product of the local culture, the social leadership, and even the climate. What we have presented here is a general template offering a reasonable reconstruction for the men and women living in the 21st century. It is as true as we can make it to the underlying spiritual concerns of our forefathers and foremothers. And what were those concerns? The same as ours today: connection with the holy powers, with the natural world, with our ancestors, with our living kin, and with our descendants yet to come. In short, the very gifts that Asatru bestows on its practitioners, whether the 20th century or the day after tomorrow.